Have you ever been involved in playing a practical joke on someone? Anybody? Yeah? All right. Now, in youth ministry, I have lots of stories that I could tell you. You know, like when we told a group of junior high girls a whole bunch of ghost stories, and then we arranged that evening for a group of guys to be in the attic of their room that night, scratching on the ceiling. But I won't bore you with all the details, but there's some pretty funny ones out there. I remember when I was first in youth ministry, I was a youth pastor in Georgia. We were doing an internship, and Christy and I were just married, and we did a beach trip with a youth group. And Christy tipped me off. She told me that they were planning something, and so I was kind of on guard the whole time. You know, I was kind of the new kid, and they had the new guy on the block, and they had to kind of initiate me, I guess, or whatever. So I remember coming in from the beach and going into the showers. And while I'm in the shower, I hear all of this rumbling going on in the room. And all of a sudden, the last measure, I think, was they ripped all the shower curtains down and just everything's out of the room. And they had taken all of the clothes, all of the bedding, all of the shower curtains, everything out of this dorm room thing while I'm in the shower. And thankfully, my wife had tipped me off, and so I had my swimsuit tucked into the soap dish, and so I pulled it out and put it on, and I walked outside. And to their dismay, they were pretty disappointed that they didn't have me. I don't know what I would have done if that wouldn't have been the case. It's funny, isn't it, to play a practical joke on someone, but it's not so fun being on the other end of it, right? This morning, we come to our story with Jacob. Now, we've been talking about him the last couple of weeks, him and his brother Esau, and he's quite the trickster, isn't he? And this week, the tides are going to turn. It's going to get turned around, and he is the one that's going to have the trick played on him. So we're going to study that together this morning, this story. You've probably heard it before, but let me invite you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 29. And in just a minute, Patty's going to come and read. But before we dive into this story, I want to just shed just a bit of light on what happens prior to this story. Now, you remember the story last week, don't you? Jacob and Esau. Jacob tricked his dad and his brother, he and his mom. They devised this plan that he would go in dressed as Esau, with Esau's clothes, with goat skins on his hands and on his neck, and they would deceive Isaac, who at that point was blind and old, into giving his blessing to Jacob, thinking it was Esau, but Jacob would then steal that blessing. That's what happened last week. Now, Esau's pretty ticked off about this deal. You remember? He comes in, he's infuriated that he's been deceived, and the blessing, because it's binding. We talked about that last week. Isaac can't do it again. And now Jacob has stolen this blessing from his father. And so now Esau is cursed and Jacob is blessed. And Esau is ready to take his life, to take Jacob's life. And he's planning a time that he can murder him. And Rebekah sees this coming. And she, again, lying to her husband, goes and tells Isaac, I want to send him over to the homeland. So maybe he'll find a wife over there. But really she's trying to preserve his life. And so she sends him out. Now, if you're Jacob at this point in time, you're probably thinking, you know, God's probably pretty ticked off at me because I've done some pretty horrible things. But on his way to this place, he has a dream, and in his dream, God appears to him. And God tells him in his dream that he's going to bless him, and that he's going to be with him, and that he's going to fulfill this promise made to his grandfather Abraham, passed to his father Isaac, and now he's in this line, and the whole world is going to be blessed through him. Jacob wakes up from the dream. He can't believe it. He's overwhelmed by God's grace, by God's mercy. Even though he was a deceiver and a trickster, God is still with him. And he wakes up from his dream. Now, I just want to show you these few verses here before we get into the story. This is in Genesis 28, so flip back to that chapter, verses 20 through 22. We read, Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat, clothes to wear, so that I will return safely to my Father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give a tenth. So here he is, very early on in terms of what God is going to do with him, but worshiping God, overwhelmed by God's grace, by God's provision. And he is making a vow to God. God, you will be my God. And this vow takes place, or this vow is kind of fulfilled by Jacob building this house, this pillar, and saying, I'm going to worship God here. And it's also fulfilled in the giving of the tithe. Jacob says, I'm going to give you a tenth of all that I have. It's a response out of God's provision for him, that he would then give God a tenth. So I just want you to see that at the end of chapter 28, and that kind of sets the stage this morning for what's happening in chapter 29. Now, Patty's going to come and read here, and I'm going to provide a chair for Patty because she'll have to come back and forth too often, and Patty wanted to make sure that her feet would touch the ground in the chair, and I think that will work. You did ask me that. That's right. So I'm going to have her sit right there, and she's going to read. There are going to be 8 parts of this reading today. So let me invite you, leave your Bibles open to Genesis 29. We're going to read a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to read some more. I'm going to talk some more. And we're going to work our way through this incredibly interesting story this morning. So she's going to begin in the first part, beginning with verse 1, and read the first 3 verses here.
Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country, with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well.
All right, we're going to pause for a minute right here in the story. I want to explain a couple of things to you. First of all, this group, this people, they're referred to as an Eastern people. And it's a little curious because you don't typically refer to this group as being an Eastern people. But many times in Scripture, when that phrase Eastern people is used, it's talking about a group of people who are not Yahweh or God followers. So it's very possible that these people are not God followers. Secondly, we learn in these first few verses how wells work in this ancient Middle Eastern climate. Now there's a well, and there is a large stone over the well. And this would help protect the water, right? Because then, contaminants are not going to go down into the water. But the stone is so large, it would require several people to move the stone. And in doing so, this would provide an accountability for the shepherds, because you couldn't come and get all the water or get more water than you would need. You would have to wait for other shepherds to join you. You would together remove the stone. Everyone would take an appropriate amount of water for their sheep. And then everyone would put the stone back, and then they would go on their way. Now, let's keep reading in verse 4.
Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said. "And here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep."
So Jacob's standing around, he's having a conversation. You got to wait for everybody to show up before we can undo the well so everybody can get water. He says, "Hey, where are you guys from?" They said, "We're from Haran." He says, "Well, that's exactly where my uncle lives. Do you guys know Laban? He's Nahor's grandson. Is he well?" And the text tells us, before they can even get the words out of their mouth, Rachel comes walking in. She comes onto the scene. It's no accident, is it, that Rachel just happens to be there at the same time that Jacob is there. I think the author of Genesis is tipping us off here to the providence of God in that Rachel comes in at just the right time. Let's keep reading. Oh, by the way, Rachel's name means ewe, E-U-E, which it means a female sheep. And that's interesting because she's a shepherdess, and that's what her name means. So let's keep reading here, verse 7.
"Look," he said, "the sun's still high. It's not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep.
So Jacob says, let's go ahead and water the sheep. And they're all like, well, we don't have enough people here. We can't move the stone yet. It's not quite time. But Jacob sees Rachel, and he's motivated to impress her, right? And so he goes over, and he moves this stone by himself. I mean, it's quite a feat. But you'll do that for a pretty woman, right? And so he's motivated, and he moves this stone on his own. Has extraordinary strength in doing so. Now, verse 11, we're going to continue to read.
Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. So she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home, and there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel.
Okay, before you picture Fabio coming in, and sweeping this girl off her feet and giving her a romantic kiss, I want you to know that this kiss here, at this point in time, is probably more like a kiss your sister kind of kiss, okay? I mean, it's a relative. He doesn't really know her at this point, and so he gives her a kiss, a very common sort of thing, and he's very happy that he's met her because he's now connected with this family. And so she runs home and gets her dad. He comes back. There is a family reunion here. They're glad to see each other. And then we're told in the text that Jacob kind of stays with them for an entire month before there's any conversation of salary or how this whole deal is going to work out. But then, after a month, Laban says, I don't expect you to work for nothing. And we're told here at the very end of this part of the text that Laban has 2 daughters, not just one. We've met Rachel, but now we see there is Leah and there is Rachel. Do you see where this is going? Let's keep reading.
Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her.
All right, everybody together. Aww. Right? 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. Now, the author describes Leah as having weak eyes. Now what does that mean? I used to read this as a kid, and I thought, well, she's the ugly one, right? But the term generally is a positive term. The NIV Bible note tells us that it speaks of fragility, vulnerability, tenderness, or a delicate quality. So it's not that she's ugly necessarily, it's just that she is delicate. It's actually a positive term. We've been watching a lot of Looney Tunes cartoons lately. Levi's getting into Looney Tunes. And I don't know if you have ever seen the ones where they go to the Middle East and there's the girl with the veil, and she's got a nice figure, and then the veil comes off and she has a big nose and warts and all of that kind of stuff. I guess as a kid I always thought Leah was was like that girl, you know. The one with the warts and the ugly face, you know. But that's not at all what it's saying. It's simply saying she has weak eyes. She's delicate. But Rachel is beautiful. Beautiful in form is how the text describes her. Her beauty far exceeds that of Leah. And Rachel is attracted to her. I'm sorry, Rachel's not. Jacob is attracted to Rachel. All these names, I just keep getting them mixed up. Now, notice too that Jacob has been with Laban now for a month. So it's not that, you know, the first day he's in love with Rachel. He's had time to get to know her. He's been able to see her, spend time with her. And after a month, he has decided that he wants her to be his wife. So he goes to Laban, or Laban comes to him and says, what should I pay you? He says, I tell you what, you give me Rachel as my wife. Laban says, okay, that's a deal. You work for me 7 years, and then I will give her as your wife. And then I love the last line there. But they seem like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Now 7 years is a long time, isn't it? But he's in love. Let's keep reading verse 21.
Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her. So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. And Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah.
All right, 7 years have passed. Now, in our culture, you might be engaged a year or two at the longest, right? But 7 years, you can imagine Jacob was very ready to marry Rachel. And so the wedding comes, and the wedding isn't like a wedding in our day and time. We had a wedding here yesterday, and it lasted for about 30, 45 minutes, and that's it, right? Well, in the ancient Near East, weddings would last some 7 days. There would be feasting. And then there would be a consummation after the first day of the wedding. And we are told that Laban somehow substitutes Leah for Rachel, and Jacob doesn't even know it. Now, you're going, what? This is in the Bible? Yeah, there it is. How did this happen, you might say? I mean, had he been drinking too much? Was it just dark outside? What was going on here? Certainly Leah would have had to participate in this deception, don't you think? I mean, this is kind of crazy here. But we read in verse 25, and I love the language here. It just simply says, when morning came, there was Leah. So he doesn't even know it until morning comes. The trickster had been tricked. The deceiver has been deceived. Let's keep reading here.
So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Laban replied, it is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also, in return for another 7 years of work. And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years.
All right, so Jacob's infuriated, right? Jacob's like, we had a deal here. 7 years ago, you told me that I would work for you, and you would give me Rachel. And now you've tricked me. Now you've given me Leah. And I love Laban's response here, don't you? Well, wait a minute now. That was a long time ago. Maybe we have things mixed up a little bit. The way we do it around here is that we always give the older before the younger. Now, isn't this an ironic phrase here because Jacob had been involved in a deception that had to do with older and younger. Do you remember that? You see, who was supposed to receive the blessing? The older. And Jacob tricked his father, and he received the blessing. Jacob had turned it around, and now it is turned around on him. Do you see that in the text? So Jacob is upset, but Laban says to him, I tell you what, we'll work this thing out. I'll give you Rachel as your wife also. We go ahead and finish the bridal week out with Leah. And what this means is there's 7 days now of feasting and consummation. And so this would give Leah an opportunity to conceive. And so Jacob agrees he will do that, and he will receive Rachel as his wife also. Now, you can imagine this is going to be problematic, don't you think? I mean, this is pretty common in this culture to have 2 wives, but no doubt the stage is set for jealousy, for resentment, for bitterness. The author of Genesis also informs us of these maidservants that are given, and we see them. They're also going to be used for conceiving children. That's a part of how it works in that culture. Let's keep reading in verse 31.
When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It's because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord had heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children.
So we see here, Rachel is unable to conceive. She is barren. This seems to be a theme, doesn't it, with the women of the promise? But Leah, God has mercy on Leah, and God opens her womb, and she's able to conceive children. Don't you feel for her as you're reading this text here? I mean, here she is. She's been involved in a deception that probably wasn't her idea, and she has been required to bear children with a man that doesn't love her, that's really in love with her sister. And that's got to be kind of awkward. It's got to be painful. And so, child after child, she's hoping Jacob's love will be greater for her, but it is not the case. But isn't it interesting how God is a God of grace here? God is going to Leah and providing for her. In the same way that he blessed Hagar, he is now blessing Leah. And our story stops there today. Our story pauses. It's not going to stop because it's going to keep going. Now, you read a story like this, and if you grew up in church, you grew up in Sunday school, you're probably like, yeah, I remember that one. But if you come into this one for the first time, you're probably going, this is in the Bible? This happened? It seems like a pretty nasty trick there, doesn't it? And what do we do with this today? I mean, how do we apply this to our lives? I mean, what do we do with this? Well, I guess we're not supposed to have more than one wife, right? It's going to get trouble, so maybe we learn that. But how does it really apply to us in the year 2012? First and foremost, I think that we need to understand that this promise that God has made to Abraham is now making its way down to the next generation. Generation after generation, we see this connection. Abraham, now Isaac. We saw the deception happen there, but now the promise is fulfilling through Jacob. And we see in this story of Jacob kind of a twist of events, right? On the one hand, and back in chapter 28, we see him worshiping God. We see him setting up a place of worship. We see him tithing. We see God's grace and mercy on him. him. It seems like God is redeeming him. God is doing in him what he needs to do. And then we get to the next chapter, and there's a lot of twists and a lot of turns. And Jacob is being formed into the man that God wants him to be. God, through this event, puts a mirror up to Jacob's face, right? And he says, look, this is what you did to your brother. Now, it's happening to you. And as we read this story, we realize that Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Laban, they're all kind of intertwined into this story of God. And it's our story this morning. Because in many ways, our story is not just this, perfect little model story, is it? There's all kinds of twists and turns along the way. And for many of us, we have played different roles and been in different places. And this morning, I'm not sure where you are, and I'm not sure how this story hits you. That's the cool thing about Genesis, isn't it? It's not necessarily prescriptive. It's not like we can read this and go, well, I need to do this more, I need to do this less. But it's a story. And as we read this story, we identify with the characters in the story in different ways. And maybe for some of us this morning, we're identifying with Jacob because we've been on the end of the deception. We've been on the end of the doing wrong. And we read this story, and we're taught through this story, at some point in time, what goes around comes around, right? At some point in time, and do you remember when we read the story with Jacob and Esau, we're going, how did this happen? Is God good with this? Isn't God going to do something about it? And God's like, yeah, wait, I have it under control. I'm going to do something about it. But not until years later does this happen. Maybe Jacob thinks, oh, we're all good now. Got by on that one, right? Until he wakes up and he looks at his bride's face and it's not her. And he felt what Esau felt. He must have felt what his father Isaac had felt. He was deceived. And God was taking him, and God was molding him, and God is making him into the man that he wants him to be. I bet he learned something, don't you think? And the story's not over yet. Jacob is going to continue to walk with God, and God's going to eventually change his name. There's a wrestling match coming, let me just warn you. And some cool things are going to happen. God's going to take Jacob and mold him into the man that he wants him to be. And maybe this morning you're identifying with Jacob. Maybe you're a deceiver. Maybe you're a liar. Maybe there's something else that you've been involved in, but you've been on the bad end of things. And maybe this morning God would be saying to you, it's time to turn it around. It's time to change my ways. It's time to learn a lesson from the behavior that I've had. Maybe that's where you are this morning. And maybe this morning you relate to Leah here. I think she's a key piece of this story. If you start looking at the description, she's in this thing. She didn't plan to be in this thing. She kind of got pulled into it. But here she is in a bad position, right? She's married to a man who's in love with her sister. And God has mercy and grace. And God opens her womb and God gives her children. And maybe this morning you're involved in a situation that you didn't plan, that you didn't necessarily instigate, but there you are and you're hurting this morning. The message is in this text, I think, that God is for you. God is with you. God is ready to offer grace and mercy for you this morning. So I'm not sure where you are in this text, but we're going to take a few minutes now and we're going to respond. And the invitation is for you to respond in whatever way you'd like to respond this morning. Maybe God has been calling you in a particular way. Maybe God's been calling you to join this church, to bring your membership and to be a part of this. I'll be standing down front if you want to come at this point. Maybe there's something that you need to handle with God privately this morning, but you'd like to come and kneel at the altar. The altar will be open for you. Would you stand and respond in whatever way that God would be leading you this morning?